you feel you've made a transition from philosopher to artist? Do you feel that your philosophical inquiry has burgeoned to include artistic practice as well as artistic theory in it?
Someone should come here and introduce Peter, this brilliant art critic and curator who was very connected with Fluxus, who is a big influence on me. It's Boyce and Yoko Ono, and I just wanted to point that out. That, yeah, for me, I think Fluxus was called Neo-Dada also at one point. So from Duchamp and Dada to like Fluxus, that's where my roots in art lie. So for me, and I'm answering the question with this, that was already philosophical. That's what I love about Dadaism, Surrealism, and Fluxus, is that they were philosophizing through art. And I don't see that happening so much anymore. And I was always passionate about art. Well, but I don't know, I still consider myself an amateur, but I say that I discovered art in my early 20s. Actually, truly, when I met this woman, the subject of Volume 3, I met her when she was finishing art school. And like, of course, going to her studio and the smell of the paintings, and that was seductive. And but I already had friends in London, so I knew something was going on at the time. The YBA, I was friends with some of the YBA artists before they became famous. And I took her from America to London because I wanted to finish my PhD. It was selfish. I was like, come to London with me so I could finish my doctorate finally, because I was 30 then, and she was a little younger. I was like, I'll get you into Goldsmiths. It's the best school in the world. And it happened, and she went to Goldsmiths. But it kind of fucked her up because she was like a brilliant figurative painter, and the conceptual deconstruction, as some of you know, and this is a thing I talk about. Art school is dangerous. It deconstructs people without regard for their sanity or their health. Now you might say the confrontation with the deconstruction of your symptom and your innocence in art is worthwhile. We're going to make you a real artist. But what they don't realize is that 90% are broken, and maybe 10% become great artists. I think there's a better way to do it. I wanted to bring the psychoanalytic dimension into studio visits. That was one of I did it a few times, but I didn't have time to carry out that project. But I wanted to bring a more psychoanalytic approach to the studio practice, where you would actually, but my good friend and colleague Simon Thompson does that, and we worked on that, and he does that in Europe. But yeah, a different approach. And so it broke her for a while, and it broke our relationship, and eventually, and she became like an exotic dancer, porn star, whatever, drug addict. But what's cool is that then she became a professor, and then she became an artist again, and that's so beautiful. Yeah, it's a weird way to answer the question. But let me think about it for a second. Definitely, I started with the philosophical psychoanalytic and was primarily there from being a teenager to 24. At 24, when I left, that's when I started to become more related to art and poetry and write. But it was it was really Tracy who pushed me into the physical art, because I would sort of like stage performances and readings in those days, in those early days. But then I left it behind for a long time and came back to it. It was hard enough to go back to finish my doctorates and open my own clinic. Although, like I've also said already, I'll say again, I consider my artistic medium or practice to be institutional invention. So I guess everything I've done is part of that work. In the sense of like creating my clinic is an artistic act, or creating this gallery is an artistic act. In some weird kind of like perverse, like what Freud would call the perverse father, who like absorbs everything and everyone. This gallery is my artwork. Anyone who's ever been a part of it is only a medium in my creation. At the same time, I'll say the opposite. I have nothing to do with this place. All these people that come here are real artists, and I'm not a real artist.
One thing I'm curious about, all the way through your history as a philosopher, psychoanalyst, artist, etc. The where, the location, the how where you were or are or have been feeds into this development.
Okay.
For instance, do I understand properly that you have clinics here and Bay Area?
No,
Here in New York?
I had a clinic in New York for 20 years, and then I came and opened some offices here before the pandemic. But then the pandemic happened, and I ended up closing all the physical offices down and only working online. But also coming here to open the clinic was conjoint with opening the gallery. So the idea of the gallery is that some of the artists we show are actually students and analysans and patients of mine, who I thought were brilliant artists, but also new artists would come to us who I thought work was involved with healing and spirituality, and that's part of the idea of it. But the pandemic mutated everything. So there's clinic offices and residential offices upstairs, but we ended up not using those in the way we intended because of the pandemic. So I don't know if that makes sense, but
very much so. It makes sense because so many people underwent the same thing.
That's true. But it's not something I've thought about. I like the question. If I was going to expound on it more, the idea, considering that I consider myself not human, like not from Earth, but like a galactic visitor, hard to live here on Earth. Perhaps location was a way of grounding me. So always through my life, I was obsessed with location. I grew up in Seattle and I loved it, and then my parents moved me to Kansas City, which was terrible. And then I left at 18 to go to Europe, and Europe transformed me. It was so radical. It was like confronted everything of my Americanism, and so much so that the whole year I spent there, because it was an accident, because they were like, oh, you want a scholarship to go to Europe? Okay, sure. And I was like, this place sucks. It's so like backwater and closed down, and like you have to put in coins to get your heater to work. It's so paltry and like austere. What's wrong with the British people? And then I came back to America, and then suddenly it was the opposite. I was pining for Europe. And so I went back to live there for 10 years, and Europe formed me as a real thinker, because there's real thought there. America's kind of young and innocent. But it's like going back and forth. Europe had the beauty of richness and history and thought, but they're stuck. They couldn't do anything. But America has the free spirit of the entrepreneur, where like anybody can open a gallery and do something. So I came back. So I moved to New York eventually in order to work, to force myself to do something and to give myself the ability to create something. So then New York became important, because it was like not hiding away in the philosophical spirit of Europe, but extroverting myself on the dark, difficult streets of New York, where you fucking get up and work every day or you fucking die. So I knew that I needed that, or I unconsciously knew, and that, yeah. So I say those were difficult years. Well, the first decade was. Yeah, so location means something. So what is the location of having the weird perversion to move to California eventually, especially Malibu? I mean, come on. What effect does that have on me? An important effect, I think. I'm not sure what it is yet, but I sent my press release to a brilliant old psychoanalyst who I like, one of the few mentors, who's like 90 years old, and showed him what I was doing, and he's like, I see the good effects that California has on you. It's liberated you from all your over-intellectual burden. So that's kind of cool.
Sort of in that vein, when in your intellectual development did you come across Duchamp and Boyce? Because it sounds like you came across them not necessarily outside, but at the edge of the artistic context.
You're absolutely right. I never allowed myself or considered myself an artist. So everything really happened for me between 22 and 24. So I moved to Europe at 20. I came back to America briefly. I finished my bachelor's, and then I spontaneously changed my mind at the last minute and went back to Europe to do my doctorate. And so those years from 22 to 24, I mean, like I said, there was this French girlfriend when I was 21 who was putting art in my field, which was new for me, along with bataille and gouacherie. I mean, it's weird. At least in terms of a non-spiritual dimension of my work, they're probably the two most important influences on my work. I actually only discovered Lacan later in retrospect from gouacherie. It was beyond Lacan, but you have to understand Lacan first to get to gouacherie, because all the brilliant artist writers in the 90s who were part of the accelerationist movement before it even existed, because that was my circle. The people who later would be called the ones who invented accelerationism and para-academia in the 2000s, we were all doing this at Goldsmiths and Warwick University, and those people who were all fucking brilliant and invisible, because that's who we were. That's what we did, is we were collective, we were creative, and we weren't interested in fame. I'm sorry if this offends people, but we weren't interested in what Bronze Age pervert calls being a face fag. And so that's all the people are interested in today, is being a face fag on social media. And so our aesthetic, my generation, and there's a whole realm in my podcast where I talk about my generation, which is the 60s and the 70s birth, which is not Generation X. It's what I call the promised generation, because we were promised what the baby boomers were aiming for, but they failed to deliver on and became conservative. So those of us who grew up in the 60s and 70s, as the background of our childhood, lived in a divine state where we were like, in the 80s, when we became adults, we're like, where did it all go? And so that was an extreme pain for me in my generation, which we haven't really talked about. I'm going to try to talk about it more. But we have a chance of a return of the repressed. We have a chance for revenge now. So that's part of what I'm doing. I'm going to get revenge before I die, because even the baby boomers are still fucking alive, and I can't even understand how it's possible. No offense. But I'm really old, and I'm like, what the fuck? So there's all these generations that are living at once. The baby boomers, who were the first ones to create this beautiful, amazing culture of freedom and positive primary narcissism. And then we were their early children who didn't have trust funds, because my parents were young when I was born. They didn't have shit. And so they didn't give me anything. They expected me to fend for myself, which I did. And then the millennials came along, who were the children of the conservative, rich baby boomers. And so they didn't have to do any work. They could just jerk off online. And I'm not saying they haven't created something interesting. I have to come to terms with it. And then there's the last generation, the Gen Z or whatever, like my daughter, who I see as brilliant, and it's kind of like, those Gen Zs are like us, the promised generation. So there's a connection between the millennials and the baby boomers, and there's a connection between the Gen Z and the Gen X promised generation. And so we failed because we wanted to be invisible and thought that everything was collective, communistic, democratic, and didn't realize some hyper-capitalism would come back in, fuck everything up. But now the Gen Z is like, they're on our side. That's what I'm passing my mantle to. So those are my disciples. So coming back out of retirement, try to pass something on and into the internet, and infiltrate the matrix.
That's an interesting construct. Generations, you skip a generation to create this intergenerational bond.
Right.
And commonly you say, you always connect with your grandparents.
Right. Oh yeah, that's a good point. Because in anthropological cultures, the parents don't raise the children because they're smart enough to know that that's fucked up. And essentially what Freud discovered is that the nuclear family is fucked up. But the older tribes knew that already. They're like, Let the grandparents raise the children. It's too close, parent-child. Don't do that. So me, as a grandparent father, who had my child, where is she? All right, my beautiful child. By the way, I considered my work on the planet to be too important to spend all that time with one child, so I didn't want to have a child. But then I ended up doing it. I won't explain why, and I fucking love my daughter. She's the most incredible person ever. Just want to say that. Everything should be a clinic. Do you know what clinic means in Greek? Of course, as I said, going back to the Greeks. Greeks are my heroes. Clinic means to lean on. So I have all these like weird like little pat phrases that I use, and now I'm going to bring them out on like social media so they can become what everybody else wants to pretend to invent, which is really cool phrases. I actually have real ones. Like, the clinic means to lean on. The clinic. So the problem is that the clinic of today is a bastard clinic. That is, that it's the doctor leans on the patient for his own egoism. But the real clinic is that the patient leans on the doctor as support. Lean on me. Give me your troubles, and then we'll try to figure it out. Okay? Don't lean on the theory, and don't lean on the patient. Don't tell them what's what. Don't tell them what's right. You got to give love, unconditional love and support to your friends and your patients, and try to help them figure out what's wrong. Just
You work with what they have.
Exactly. Yeah. Take them at their own word.
That'd be an interesting way of running an art school.
I think that would be great. Should we start one? He's like, no, I'm too old for that. I'm too old for that. We can put the ideas out there and someone else can do it. Okay, who's going to open an art school? It's going to be a psychoanalytic art school, where you come to art school, and I'm not saying that criticizing and confronting and deconstructing your students is bad. That's probably good. It's like, it's harsh love. Maybe the abusive parental relationships that have been around for thousands of years are good too, I guess. I don't know. But it would be even better if you could, imagine that. You could be fascinated by every student. You could go into their studio and be like, this is incredible. I want to see what you're creating. Whatever you're putting in your art is something unique and something about your truth. Let's talk about it. Tell me more. So you could refine their art. I mean, this is Lacan. You wanted me to talk about Lacan. I'm not talking about that bastard. I'm not giving him credit anymore. Who taught me how to refine the symptom. You don't cut the symptom out. You don't cover it up. You don't say, like, this is your symptom, that's wrong, we're getting rid of it. Because in the textbooks, that's sick. Your symptom holds the truth to who you are. Okay, so this is my theory. I have a lot of advancements over Lacan, which is sacrilege to my Lacanian colleagues. They're like, how could you say that you have advanced Lacan? Listen, I did the work. I studied him for decades. This is what I believe. So I say, you're born with a singularity. The singularity is what you're supposed to do on earth. It's your style, your trait. And that's positive narcissism, primary narcissism, which Freud defines as when you realize you have a body and you want to enjoy yourself in the world. And the young child is just running around, exploring everything and having fun. You feel that primary narcissism, that aliveness. And then their parents and the strangers are immediately blunting them and fucking them up by being embarrassed by their aliveness and their curiosity and their vitality and telling them what to do or telling them to shut up. And so the trait, the singularity of the subject, it's always there in the soul and in the 1, 2, 3-year-old of primary narcissism is learning censorship from the outside world. And it's going to keep happening because then that person will be later the censor of their children and other people. So how do we break the cycle? By indulging in our own healthy primary narcissism, which you try to rediscover through art. Art gives you to go back to that place where, like, let me sit down here with some paint and objects. Yeah, basically just a bunch of fucking rocks and shit. Let me paint with my shit. Because they made me feel bad about that I painted a painting with my piss or my shit. And let me do that. So art is so important in this healthy healing process of transformation for the planet. So we shouldn't censor people. We shouldn't put shame on people. We should let them indulge in their desires and let them find the limits of that or the mistakes of that.
Do you know who could create a clinic art school? The Jungians.
Sounds good. I become more and more Jungian. Again, I'm coming out of the closet because Jung himself is shamed in the psychoanalytic world as not being a real psychoanalyst, even though he was Freud's greatest follower and pupil. But Jung went into the occult and the spiritual. Therefore, he's not a real psychoanalyst. We have to get rid of him. But that's bullshit. He went further than Freud. He went to another dimension. He remained scientific and practical and clinical, but also you know what? The crazy. I gave a bunch of lectures from 2016 to 2020 in my psychoanalytic institute, which I also closed down. I gave 4 years of lectures on what I call the Big Four, it was called I'm going to transcribe it and publish it as books soon. It's called the advanced psychoanalysis for beginners, something like that. In other words, you can teach the most advanced thing in a simple way for beginners and say, don't make the mistake of all that bullshit. Okay, so now just going in, since you brought up Jung, I'm just going into another little pet peeve of mine. Freud, Jung, Wilhelm Reich, Jacques Lacan, the four greats. They were all doctors, they were all philosophers. If you were to absorb the totality of even one of those persons' work, it would be incredible. If you could absorb all four of them, which nobody's ever done, I don't think, besides me. Again, I'm not being narcissistic. If someone else has, I want to know them. Because that's what you're taught in all your circles, that these things don't go together. If you're a Freudian, you have to hate Jung, or vice versa. For me, it was always more and more and more. Let's study all of them. Let's bring them all together. And I think they're all brilliant. And the fact that they have totally different opinions and different approaches makes it even more interesting and more scientific. Otherwise, what's science other than a religion, fundamentalism? So, Jung, is an amazing psychoanalyst and spiritual philosopher. And although I'd have to say that in terms of the art world, Lacan's closer to the official art world, or even the true art world, probably. He understands art, I think,
but
modern art, better than Jung.
In the art world, you can have the possibility of paying attention to, giving credence to, believing in what Freud and or Jung taught, and then at the same time be looking at Gurdjieff, Ouspensky, Steiner.
Absolutely. Now you're talking my language. That's why we're here. Beautiful. It's incredible. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I feel like, you tell me, because you have much more experience in the art world, I feel like the art world is always against the spiritual people. Like, they say, that's not cool, that's not art. That art has so much to do with irony and cynicism. It's not like real spirituality and believerism.
You're a couple of years behind.
Oh, good. You mean everyone's into spirituality now?
The breakthrough is still in process.
Awesome.
But there is a new embrace of the spiritually motivated, the spiritually manifested. The great example is the very successful survey of the work of Hilma af Klint.
Oh yeah, I saw the show in New York. Love it.
Well, it was in where was it? The Guggenheim.
Yes, okay. Thank you. I thank you. Maybe I'm in the right place. Maybe the world's finally catching up.
Over 100 years after her death, yes.
And she's right. She's
And those, like, oh yeah, there was that book, that show about the Santa Fe artist too. Also
the transcendental.
Yes.
paying
Oh,
show here.
you're right. It's very exciting, and so hopefully I'm in the right place at the right time, where all these things which were conflictual for me are coming together, and we're able to join them somehow. To be honest, that's why I always liked, even when I was young and ignorant of the art world, I always was partial to the LA artists because they were connected to the spiritual, like Mike Kelly and Tony Arsler. All these people are connected to occultism and like spiritual gurus and cults. That always seemed interesting to me, that there was like a freedom here and a connection with the kind of California spiritual scene. It wasn't as dry and cynical as New York. So, all right. Well, I'm not sure if we're ready yet. What time is it? Are we ready to transition to the public discussion? What do you think?
I think the public is itching to transition.
Okay. All right. Yes. Well, yeah, what I referred to like an hour ago as the Art Ghetto was just a concept in my own mind when I was 30 years old, when I was like, should I go back to finish my doctorates, or should I go to art school and just be an artist? And then I thought, whatever I'm inspired by in Duchamp and Beuys, I want to do it in the world at large, not just in the art world, because I feel like the world said, even though what the artists did in the art world is incredible, I feel like the compromise the world made was like, okay, you can do whatever you want in the art world, but you're going to stay in the art world. If you try to do it somewhere else, then that's way out of line. So I set myself that task in a weird way. So that's the ghetto I was talking about. I don't know if you want to refer to that.
Well, to create actively an intersection between the art world and the academic world on one hand, and the world of psychology, psychoanalysis, etc., on the other. That you're having multiple intersections. You're creating your own intersectionality.
Right. I mean, again, I'm not trying to be narcissistic. Quite the opposite. I'm trying to pave the way for others to do this. But can you tell me someone else who's done what I'm trying to do? In other words, Freud didn't understand art at all. And Jung didn't really either. Lacan did. He made art in his practice. He performed in his seminars as an artistic performance, and he wrote performative material. But everybody thinks or assumes it's psychoanalysis. It is psychoanalysis, and that's why so many analysts are obsessed with Lacan, because he did what artists do within the world of psychoanalysis, but neither Lacan nor any of Lacan's followers understand that he did art in psychoanalysis. But he also never did art in the sense that he never branched out or bridged the gap into art. So the question is, can I do art in psychoanalysis or in medicine, and can I also make art itself as something? Or then people say, well, you didn't go to art school, so you're not a real artist. What does that mean? I don't know. Let's see what happens. I mean, it's a question for me. So the intersectionality, yeah, is like it is an attempt to break down those barriers. I would like to think that I could break down those barriers and the floodgates would open in an instant. And then all of a sudden, it would all be happening. You know why? Because they were all held back by censorship. Because if you're the one that breaks the censorship, you're at risk of being crucified. And I'm not saying I haven't been crucified. Believe me, I've been crucified in some areas. But I also kept myself hidden in a lot of ways so that I wouldn't be crucified, so that I could play the long game, and then I could say, okay, here it is. Too late to crucify me because it's already here. Do what you want with it. I didn't want to be crucified. I didn't have a desire to be crucified like Jesus or Dionysus. Perhaps, I don't know. I mean, Nietzsche, one of my great loves, in his last works where he was going insane. I mean, okay, well, let me go into this for a second. Nietzsche took the deconstruction of thought and meaning as far as it had ever been taken at the time of his life. And he went crazy for it. He paid the price. So he was crucified in his own mind for thinking that thought. Nobody did it to him. And Rudolf Steiner, who was a clairvoyant, spiritual clairvoyant, who kept it secret throughout his life in his 20s and 30s, but then became an academic philosopher, PhD, etc. He archived Goethe, and he saw that Goethe was an alchemist who understood the spiritual dimension in relation to the rational scientific dimension, the 1600s, 1700s, the last of his kind. And he said, oh, well, here's a guy I can model myself after. It's like, I'm not just a weirdo who like can see spiritual visions. I don't have to hide myself anymore. I can find a way to bring it out. And then Nietzsche's sister met Steiner and said, will you archive Nietzsche's work too? And Steiner went to visit Nietzsche's sister, and Nietzsche had already been catatonically insane for several years. And Steiner said, yeah, I went to the house, and I saw that Nietzsche's works were great. He said, in my spiritual clairvoyance, I saw that Nietzsche was not insane. It was that his soul, his mind was detached from his body. And I had a conversation. You might think I'm crazy for saying this. I'm just reporting. I'm not saying I have conversations with spiritual people. Maybe I do, maybe I don't. That doesn't mean I can't be cynical and ironic, etc., etc. That's the beauty of it. Steiner was such a boring priest. Why can't you do both? Why can't you be like, ironic and sexual and practical and also be spiritual? So Steiner was having a spiritual conversation with Nietzsche's soul, and Nietzsche was like, yeah, it was too much for me. I'm still on Earth. I don't want to die. I don't want to disappear yet, but I'm not really here. So his soul was floating outside of his body, and he went through too much. He went too far at the time, and mostly because he didn't have a community. So when Nietzsche said, I've realized that there's no truth in the world, no one's ever really realized that before, and there's no one to share it with. It's that he didn't have a community of people to share it with. That's why he was so disconnected. No, he couldn't experience it with anybody. And Steiner understood it, but it was too late. And Steiner wrote a book, one of his early books, as he was still a young man, about Nietzsche, called Nietzsche Freedom Fighter, in which he basically said Nietzsche took the spiritual dimension of free choice, free will, as far as it could be taken on Earth, as much as any Buddhist or Taoist ever wanted to say. Because he didn't have a community. He didn't have a community of spiritual people like in Buddhism or Taoism to make sense of that with. He was doing it all on his own, which in some ways was part of the whole idea. Because it was like, here's a regular guy who's falling outside of the system and crucified because of it. So Nietzsche was a kind of Christ figure in his own way, which Steiner redeemed by writing this book about him. And then he basically said, what I've done, Steiner, what we have to do is we reach a point like Nietzsche where we realize that the rational and the scientific it stops here. It's what I, Dr. Vaughn, call the spiritual ceiling. You reach the spiritual ceiling, and there's nothing more that the intellect or the mind or reason can say anymore. And you have two choices. You go crazy, or you open up to the spiritual dimension. And that's always a risk. So that's what Steiner chose. The fact that he used Nietzsche as this case example of that is beautiful. And that goes back to my original doctoral thesis that I didn't write about technology and nihilism, about how we're all being pushed to that spiritual ceiling. And that's where my new project, my Spiritual Revolution podcast and my school called The Healing for Body, Mind, and Spirit, is I'm trying to take what I did before to another level. So I'm still teaching people how to be their own doctors and their own analysts, but I'm coming out of the spiritual closet and saying there's no way we're going to solve the problems of today, individually or culturally, unless we open up to the spiritual in some dimension.
Was a reaction to the spirituality that infused the early 20th century radical artists.
Right.
Not necessarily the Dadaist so much, but, or the futurists, but the Cubo-futurists in Russia.
Okay.
The style in Holland.
Right.
Mondrian was a disciple of Blavatsky and.
Oh, right.
Malevich was for his mind. He was painting the icons of the future.
That's exciting. So do you think that that spirituality was like, I don't know, was it a conspiracy to like eradicate the spiritual from art? So that art could become like nihilistic?
No, it was just skepticism run wild.
Okay.
Which happens in a discourse like the artistic discourse, that a proposition is put forward, there's a reaction to it, and then there's an overreaction to it that, given the conditions, can maintain for quite a while and create this kind of almost natural boundary between what you want to say or what you perceive and what you want to share and what other people are perceiving.
But it's almost making me think like that why never the twain shall meet. Why does spirituality appear in the guise of like, I don't know, like boring bullshit? And why does art seem so cool? And why are these two things separated? Why, even when they appear like in Malevich or in Beuys, it's almost as if people can't conceptualize that. They have to separate it. They have to like ignore it.
Well, I mean, there are layers of conventional religion that we have to shed to get to the more what seemingly amorphous spiritual.
Okay, right. So then all I can say is that like Blavatsky, Malevich, Beuys, Duchamp, Philip Dick, this is just the birth of the new earth. It's been happening for a century, but that's a blip in time compared to thousands of years of suffering and ignorance on earth. So maybe it's still happening, and we just have to carry it forward. We have to be true to it, because it's happening.
Right. Now you sound like a boomer.
Great, let's do it. Let's all get on board.